Merhabalar. Bugün sizlerle George Floyd'un polis tarafından katledilmesi sonrası başlayan ve halen devam eden ayaklanmalar ışığında Minneapolis'in kentleşmesindeki ırkçı uygulamaların etkilerini tartışacağız. Mapping Prejudice, Önyargı Haritalama ekibinden Minnesota Üniversitesi Coğrafya Bölümü doktora öğrencisi Kevin Ehrman-Solberg ile birlikteyiz. Kendisi bize Amerika Birleşik Devletleri, Minneapolis kentinde 20. yüzyılın başlarında beyaz olmayan halkların mülk edilmesini engelleyen Tapu Şerhleri ve bu şerhlerin bugün etkilerinden bahsedecek. Hi Kevin, thank you for meeting with us. Could you please tell us about the Prejudice Map project? Who are you? How did you start? What was the motivation behind?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. My name is Kevin Ehrman-Solberg. I co-founded Mapping Prejudice with Dr. Kirsten Delegard, Penny Peterson, and Ryan Matke about 4 years ago now. Genesis of the project was really had to do with this contradiction, I would say, in the popular kind of imagination of Minneapolis. So in the United States, Minneapolis has a reputation as being a progressive, liberal city. However, Minneapolis has some of the worst racial disparities of any metropolitan area in the entire country. So there's this tension between this idea of Minneapolis as being this, liberal, progressive, kind of cutting edge urban environment, while at the same time being one of the worst places to live if you are not white. And the kind of I can contextualize that a little bit. For example, in Minneapolis, 75% of white families own the home that they live in. Less than 25% of black families in Minneapolis own the home that they live in. And that gap, that 50% gap, that's the worst in the United States. Of the 100 largest metropolitan areas, Minneapolis has the largest gap between black and white homeownership rates. If you look at other measures of kind of inequality, right, like the Educational Equality Index, which measures the differentiated performance between black students and white students in K-12 education, we're ranked second to last, if I'm remembering correctly. And you can kind of just go down this list. Whatever indicator you look at, the gap between white residents and black residents in the city is either the worst in the country or one of the worst in the country. So Mapping Prejudice started as a way to try to understand how those disparities materialized, right? Dr. Delegard, she's a historian. I'm trained as being trained, I should say, as a geographer. So we wanted to kind of unearth some of the historical and spatial context of what is kind of going on in Minneapolis and how we got to where we are. And we found very kind of early on that this thing called the racial covenant was potentially one of the explanatory variables. It might help us understand, right? Like how we got to these crazy large gaps between black and white homeownership. And a racial covenant is a thing used. It's still actually used, covenants are still used. Racial covenants are illegal, but essentially it's just a line of text. It goes in the warranty deed, which is the piece of paper that says that so-and-so owns a home, right? And it's a clause that puts restrictions on that property. So they say things like, and I'm quoting here, one of the common covenants that we found says that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be sold, leased, or mortgaged to any person or person who is not a full-blooded member of the Caucasian race. So essentially what that means, right, is once you add a racial covenant to the legal record of a property, it becomes illegal for anybody who isn't white to own or occupy that home. And covenants track with the land and not the individual, which is an important distinction to make. So what this means in practice, if in say 1910, I buy a house and I put a racial covenant on it. 10 years later, I sell the house to a white person. 10 years after that, they sell the house to a white person. 10 years after that, that person tries to sell the home to somebody who isn't white. I've never met that person, but I actually have legal standing to sue the person who's trying to sell the home and forcibly reclaim the property. The person who tried to sell to somebody who is not white, they have broken the covenant. and they lose the property, any equity they've accumulated, any value they've put into the home, and it reverts to me, the person who first put the covenant into place. And if I'm dead at that point, my children actually have legal standing to do the same thing, to forcibly reclaim the property. So for all intents and purposes, once you add a racial restriction into a home or into the property record, it's there forever. There were several Supreme Court rulings, both federally and in the state, as well as federal and state legislation that did make this practice illegal. It is no longer legal to add one of these racial covenants to a home. Minnesota specifically made it illegal in the mid-1950s. And then the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which was federal legislation, made the practice of putting a racial covenant into place illegal everywhere in 1968. And there was a series of Supreme Court rulings as well in the 40s, late 40s and early 50s that made it much more difficult to kind of legally enforce these racial covenants. So that's kind of what racial covenants are. But the thing, especially as scholars, that's frustrating. I mean, there are many things that are frustrating when studying something like this, but from kind of a data perspective, there's no city in the country that's ever tried to map all of the racial covenants. So there's no database. We don't know how many racial covenants were put in a given community. We don't know how long they were in effect for. We don't know, are we talking hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of homes? We don't know the answer to that. We don't know which communities put covenants in and which ones did not. So the Mapping Prejudice project really started to try to do that, to build this first kind of comprehensive accounting map database of racial covenants for a major metropolitan area.
I think you are mapping the covenants voluntarily and collectively. So perhaps it would be nice for you to announce that, and maybe there might be some volunteers to contribute to your project. Perhaps it would be nice for you to explain how you work and how you map it.
I mentioned earlier that no other city or community has done mapping of this scale in regard to racial covenants before. And the reason for that is really a technical problem more than anything else. The only way to find a racial covenant is to read a warranty deed, read that document that denotes ownership. The problem is that, just in Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is, you're talking about millions and millions and millions of pages of documents. So reading through all of that, if it's just one researcher, it's not possible. We need a way to kind of automate that. So we use optical character recognition, which is a way of turning kind of scanned images of documents into like Word documents. Like, a document a computer can actually identify certain words. So we do that. We then use some programming scripts to identify the deeds, the documents that likely contain a racial covenant. So we look for words like Caucasian. If we find a word like Caucasian, we grab that deed and put it in like the likely covenants pile, right? This allows us to narrow down millions of records into the tens of thousands that likely contain racial language, but we still need volunteers. We need somebody to verify that information and to read the document and enter certain values, code it in a certain way so we can then map that restriction. And we're doing that through crowdsourcing. So on our website, if you click on the Get Involved button at the top, it'll take you to this platform called Zooniverse, where we have thousands of volunteers who just read these flagged deeds. They read these deeds that likely contain covenants. It's a fairly painless process, I would say. It takes maybe about 5 minutes per document. And essentially just, you go on there, you log in, create an account, it'll pull up a deed, and it just asks you some questions. It asks, is there a racial covenant? Yes or no. If there is, type it in for us. Who bought the property? Who sold the property? What's the date? Information like that. And then based on those user answers, that actually gives me the kind of data in the right form where I can do the mapping work.
In fact, I wonder how those covenants were initiated? Who was the first one to announce those, or was the state involved in it, or the private, I don't know, developers? Who were they?
It's different based on city, and it's kind of hard to make really good like blanket statements because no other city has mapped covenants like we have. But I do know through some work, some more qualitative work, and some limited mapping projects across the country that it's a wide range of people and organizations and entities that are doing racial covenants. In Minneapolis specifically, the leading kind of force behind racial covenants were private real estate developers. So the pattern that emerged, and the first covenant we found in Minneapolis is in 1910, and at that time, much of Minneapolis had not been developed yet. A lot of it was still farmland. Minneapolis is a comparatively young city. And what wound up happening in the first half of the 20th century, roughly, is developers would buy somebody's farm kind of at the edges of the city. They would turn that farm into, hundreds of residential lots. And when they did that, when they converted these large chunks of land into these smaller chunks designed for, like putting a house or apartment building or whatever on, that's when they put in the racial covenant. And they would use that as kind of an advertising tool. So we found a lot of material of developers kind of bragging about racial covenants, saying, hey, if you want to buy this lot, we have taken steps to ensure that nobody who isn't white will ever be one of your neighbors. And they're kind of pushing that narrative as like a good thing, a good thing, with the quote around that one. So that was kind of the primary initial driving force. But what wound up happening is that the federal government, let me back up a little bit. So one of the arguments that I make is that racial covenants really normalized this idea that residential segregation was a good thing. That prior to racial covenants, at least in Minneapolis, the city was not that segregated. The Black population was pretty low, but it was fairly kind of evenly spread out throughout the city. But by mid-century, after racial covenants had been legal for many decades, the city had become very segregated. So this idea, right, that a good neighborhood is racially homogenous, it's racially monolithic. Racial covenants did a lot of work in kind of convincing people of that. And the federal government listened. So when the federal government began insuring mortgages during the Great Depression, the federal government kind of stepped in, started making it easier for people to buy homes. They were underwriting people's mortgages. They took a lot of the ideas of racial covenants and kind of formalized them. So, for example, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, that's the part of the federal government that underwrites mortgages. They actually say explicitly in their underwriting manual that they will not give the best rates to any home unless that property has a racial covenant in place. So you wind up with this feedback loop, right, where local developers, they put in racial covenants. The federal government sees that. It's like, oh, that's a good idea. We're going to make it so, you need to put in racial covenants in order to get the best, monetary rates. So you kind of get this reinforcing cycle between these local developers and the federal government that are both kind of collectively producing the same result, which is a huge increase in white home ownership and a decrease in Black home ownership. And that kind of gap has not changed, really. In many respects, it's actually gotten worse over the last few decades. So although these kind of particular policies are no longer legal, the effects are very, very much still with us.
And this would be a broader question, but what was the political economic background of that era in 1910s in US in general?
I'm trying to think. There's a few different ways to answer that question. One way of thinking through that is that in the United States during that period, the Great Depression proved to be this really transformative political event, as it was for countries around the world. Right, this wasn't a localized thing, but it did result in it resulted in a bunch of things, but the realignment, kind of the political realignment that emerged from that, one saw a very large expansion of the federal government and kind of what people thought the federal government could and could not do. The New Deal programs, along with kind of the post-war prosperity, enabled what one Tom Segru, a historian, called the largest expansion of the middle class in the history of the United States. So the period of racial covenants was also the period of really large class mobility at a scale we really haven't seen. We haven't seen since then. But that class mobility was restricted on racial lines. So one of kind of the effects of that, once racial covenants and redlining and some of these federal practices became illegal, the broader economic context had shifted. There was, by the 1970s, these kind of, you weren't going to be able to buy a newly constructed home on a working class salary with a, GI Bill federal loan with a super, super low interest rate. Like that stuff just doesn't exist anymore. So there was this period of economic opportunity, but during that period, these hard racial lines were kind of encoded into the landscape. And once those lines were removed, the economic opportunity wasn't the same. So like it was a very transformative period, but the benefits were very differentially allocated. And once the benefits were allocated, it's been very difficult to kind of replicate that same sort of mobility that earlier generation had.
So you mentioned a lot about the covenants with respect to today's racial system, but I see in your website the clusters of the covenants. And what do you think about those clusters? What do they signify, in fact? I also tried to search online where George Floyd was killed, and I see it was in Powderhorn Park, and it seems close to the clusters of the covenants mapped in your project. So could you discuss it with respect to today's everyday life of the Black people?
Yeah, certainly. So kind of initially, some of the effects of covenants are very easy to quantify. So we know that covenanted areas of the city are 20% whiter on average than the city average, right? So even after being illegal for 50 years, blocks with racial covenants, city blocks with racial covenants, are significantly whiter than the city in total. We also know that the economic impact of home valuation breaks very hard on the presence or lack thereof of racial covenants. And kind of what I mean by that, if you take the city median home value and compare that to the median value of racially covenanted properties, racially covenanted properties overperform the city median by about 15%. So they're worth 15% more than city median. Homes in redlined areas that are structurally identical to racially covenanted homes underperform city median by about 25%. And we know that areas were redlined because of the presence of people of color. The federal government was very explicit in viewing the presence of people of color as a risk, which is why those areas were redlined and why people trying to buy in those areas were often denied loans by the federal government. So the kind of gap. So if you take maybe an example is a better way to illustrate this. If in 1930 you take two homes, they're identical. They were both built in the same year. One of them subsequently gets redlined, and one of them subsequently has a racial covenant attached. The racially covenanted home is going to be worth about 40% more than the redlined home today, even though there are no intrinsic differences between like the properties. They're same lot size, same structure size, same number of amenities, all of that. And that's about $100,000 USD price difference. So the ability of these families buying homes in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and their ability to pass on wealth to their children is largely impacted by whether or not those homes had racial covenants and whether or not those homes were in redlined areas. And this connects very directly with where George Floyd was killed. He was killed kind of on the southern border of the old South Side, which is by Powderhorn. It's a historically kind of Black neighborhood, but it's right kind of at the border where the redlined area stops and the racially covenanted area begins. And as you know, geographers know, borders are always contested. And that's certainly been the case in Minneapolis, even kind of beyond George Floyd. Some of the worst cases we have of like white racial violence against Black families, kind of in the era of covenants, took place in roughly that same liminal space. So that area between the redlined Black communities and these racially covenanted, almost homogeneously white communities, the stuff in between was often the site of struggle. That's where one example, the Lee family, a Black family, they bought a house kind of in that strip between the covenants and the Black community. And really within a few days, over 1,000 white people surrounded the home. They started shooting through the windows. They killed the family's dog. Their daughter, Mary, required a police escort just to go to school safely. And this happened in the 1930s, but it's another illustration of what happens when you racially code space like that, and then what happens when those boundaries are transgressed. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, police violence against, you know, people of color, against Black bodies often happens in these areas that are deemed as kind of borders.
And also I'll ask about the gentrification processes of Minneapolis. So what is the contribution of gentrification into those oppressive built-in system that you've mentioned?
Yeah, so gentrification is complicated, but it's kind of in some ways sort of the full circle, right? So to give a very kind of simplified picture, right? When homes became redlined, it became impossible to buy one of them with a loan because banks and the federal government said this is too risky. You know, the presence of these Black people means it's a bad investment. We won't lend you any money. And what that does, it makes values go way down because most people can no longer afford to buy there because most people do not have enough money to buy a house outright. You know, you have to go through a bank, you have to go through a loan. It opens it up for speculative real estate investment, which is what happened in Minneapolis and many other communities. So the only people buying in these redlined neighborhoods tended to be these the large landowning class, where they come in, they buy a bunch of, you know, single family homes and turn them into rentals, or they buy a bunch of duplexes, they buy some apartment buildings. But the ownership is no longer in that community. The people living there become predominantly renters, and the people who own it tend to be white people who live often in racially covenanted you know, parts of the city or suburbs. What winds up, one of the things that kind of happens with gentrification, you know, as these property values increase, the beneficiaries of kind of that material increase are not the people living in those neighborhoods. They're the landowning class who do not live in those neighborhoods. So it's kind of like, you know, if you bought your home in an area that became redlined in 1950, you know, it's hard to hold on to that because your property value is going down. A lot of those homes become foreclosed. A lot of them became foreclosed in Minneapolis during the financial crisis of 2008. That property, when it's cheap, goes to this landowning class, and now gentrification is elevating the value of the properties they bought very, very cheaply. And all of that economic benefit is going to this predominantly white landowning class. It's not going to the residents in those communities. So you kind of wind up with a situation where these historical Black communities, you know, they were hurt real bad by redlining. The ones that were able to stay through all of that are now getting forced out due to gentrification. So it's kind of this continual, you know, realignment of what is good, desirable space, and that's kind of a constantly changing, constantly negotiated process. But the way gentrification is playing out is as areas of the city become, quote unquote, desirable again, the economic benefit of that increase of desirability is going to the exact same people who benefited from structural racism and the legacies of structural racism.
Could you evaluate the Black lives in Minneapolis with respect to class and also in terms of their locations in the city?
Yeah, so Mapping Prejudice, just kind of as a project, we are particularly focused on the role of housing and the economic impacts of, housing. That's kind of our field of expertise. And it's also, I think, very important to put limits on what we as a project can reasonably talk about. And the fact is, like, I am a white man living in Minneapolis. Like, I don't know the Black experience. I can't really speak to that. I can point you in the direction of a bunch of, Black activists, scholars, academics, whatever, who can. But what we can contribute with Mapping Prejudice is just kind of one small piece of this much, much larger narrative. And based on our skill set, we can do some of this historical work. We can do some statistical work. We can help add historical context to contemporary disparities. But there's a limit to what we can kind of reasonably contribute to this conversation. At least that's kind of how I feel about that.
And I've been reading on not in detail, but reading on the municipal reforms of the leaders of Minneapolis on the local zoning code. And I think there are some symbolic renouncements of the covenants. What are they, in fact? And do you think they work or they mean something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Minneapolis just passed, it's called the 2040 plan, which is the long-term kind of urban planning guideline, so to speak. So, how is the city going to try to steer development for the next 20 years? And one of the things that they found is that single-family zoning in Minneapolis has contributed, I would say, to, I think the authors of the plan would say too, has contributed to racial inequality. We've found that areas that had racial covenants on them were more likely to be zoned as single family districts. And how zoning kind of works in Minneapolis, you're not allowed to build whatever you want wherever you want it. We have these different kind of categories of zones that determine what type of structures can be built. So if an area or a neighborhood is zoned as single family, the only thing you can build there is a single family home. You cannot build an apartment building. You cannot build commercial buildings. You cannot build a duplex, so like a two-family home or anything like that, right? And what's kind of wound up happening in Minneapolis is these single-family zoned areas become increasingly expensive. It's very hard to put any sort of affordable housing into these neighborhoods because the zoning code is so restrictive. And many of these neighborhoods zoned as single family were also the neighborhoods that had racial covenants. So municipal zoning, municipal zoning was not as explicitly racist as racial covenants, but what it did do was kind of lock into place these very unequal patterns of ownership and patterns of development as they existed in the 1950s when racial covenants were legal. The first official zoning code was put into place I think it was 1 year after racial covenants were no longer legal. So there's definitely kind of a continuation there. So one of the things that the 2040 plan is doing is that it's upzoning the entire city, which means that anywhere in Minneapolis, you can now build a multi-family building up to 3 units. So you can't put an apartment building anywhere you want, but you can put a 3-unit building anywhere you want. And it also, it's a large plan. It does a bunch of things. We're most interested kind of in this connection between zoning and racial covenants. As to its efficacy, I think it's a necessary step. I think exclusionary zoning is pretty much guaranteed to reproduce this unequal distribution of like land and value as we currently have it. But I don't think it solves the problem either. It opens up the city for new strategies of development and new kind of ways of thinking about how and where we do and do not live and under what conditions. But by itself, I don't think it fixes all of that much necessarily. I mean, it needs to be coupled with a commitment to like affordable development. It needs to be coupled with a commitment to some form of, in my opinion, reparations or restorative justice to kind of put money back into these historically Black communities that through things like racial covenants have been discriminated against for, you know, almost the entire history of the city. So I think the 2040 plan allows for more of that work to take place, but that work isn't going to do itself. That's something we have to organize around. That's something we have to advocate for.
Many of your responses, in fact, answers that question, but I will ask again. What do you think about the complicity of urban planning in discrimination, dislocation, or oppression? In other words, like, do you see urban planning as a partner in crime in that sense?
Yes. Yeah. One, I think, very clear example is where highways were put into the city, where freeways were put in starting in the late 50s and through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in Minneapolis, they very intentionally put highways through Black neighborhoods, displacing thousands and thousands of people, causing the property values in the areas like very close to the freeway to go down significantly. There's one part of the city where they actually, the planners kind of at the last minute decided to reroute the freeway several blocks in the other direction because by doing that, you would go through a Black community and you wouldn't disturb a museum. They were like, we'd rather not move a museum and we'd rather displace, you know, several blocks of Black families. A lot of the urban redevelopment that happened in the 1960s and the 1970s in Minneapolis was also explicitly racist, where the idea was to destroy you know, these existing Black communities. They called it slum removal or slum clearance. That was the language of the time, which also had these horrible effects on these communities by just displacing, you know, all of these people, and often replacing the, you know, historical structures with like parking lots and, you know, these things like that. So urban planning has very much been complicit and an active partner in producing this unequal geography, certainly in Minneapolis, and I think most people would say nationally as well.
And even internationally as well. Yeah. And after the killing of George Floyd, are there any reactions from the planners, geographers, architects, from the milieu of the academics?
I'm sure there are. I will say, or in the last 2 weeks, I've been spending almost all of my time doing direct action mutual aid work. So I'm actually not super plugged in to the academic response to the murder of George Floyd. But I'm sure those responses are out there. I just have not had the time to look into them.
But what do you think about those academic responses? Like, do they really mean something, or do they contribute in changing something, or what do you think?
Now I am speaking on behalf of myself.
Yeah, please.
I mean, this project, I just want to make that distinction clear. Yeah, I think there is right now a desire to, for lack of a better word, kind of capitalize on what's been going on, and a desire amongst academics, especially, to like view this as just kind of a new data point in their theoretical work. And personally, I'm resistant to that. I think the unknowability of this moment, precisely because this uprising that I've seen in Minneapolis feels so unprecedented. It feels so kind of, you know, this doesn't just like neatly fit into a lot of the existing kind of theoretical frameworks. Nobody was predicting that this would happen, and the unknowability of this moment. I would like to preserve that. I think because it feels so unprecedented, it's opening up all of these new avenues of action that people haven't taken seriously before or haven't thought were practical or achievable before. And all of a sudden they feel like, we might actually be able to do things like defund or abolish the police department. We might be able to do things like commandeer hotels to house homeless people. That's an effort that I've been involved in over the last few weeks. But I don't think theorizing this moment necessarily helps with that work. I think there's a place for academic work. There's a place for research, but there's also a time to, get out in the street and try to make this happen. And personally, I've been devoting my limited time to doing that over the last few weeks. That seems like the more urgent need.